I remember the excitement I felt when my friends and I decided to go on a road trip across the country. We were young and reckless, with nothing but the open road and our dreams ahead of us. We piled into our beat-up van, cranked up the radio, and hit the road. The first few days were filled with laughter and adventure. We visited quirky roadside attractions, sampled local cuisine, and took endless selfies. But as we ventured further from home, things began to feel different. The air grew heavy with a sense of unease, and our once carefree spirits began to dim. It all started on a desolate stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere. The sun was setting and we were running low on gas. We pulled into a rundown gas station that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1950s. As we were filling up, an old man with a weathered face and a limp approached us. "Y'all ain't from around here, are ya?" he asked, eyeing us suspiciously. We tried to make small talk, but he seemed to grow increasingly agitated. He warned us to stay off the back roads and to be careful of the things that lurked in the shadows. We shrugged it off as the ramblings of a crazy old man and got back on the road. That's when things took a turn for the worse. Our van broke down in the middle of nowhere, with no cell service and no one around for miles. We were stranded, with no choice but to wait for someone to come along and help us. As the night wore on, the silence was broken only by the sound of rustling leaves and snapping twigs. We huddled together, feeling increasingly vulnerable and afraid. That's when we heard it, a low growling sound that seemed to be getting closer and closer. Suddenly, a pair of glowing eyes appeared in the darkness. We scrambled to our feet and ran as fast as we could, heart pounding in our chests. We stumbled through the woods, trying to find our way back to the main road. But the deeper we went, the more lost we became. Hours turned into days as we wandered through the wilderness, surviving on nothing but our wits and our dwindling supplies. The growling became a constant presence, haunting us every step of the way. We tried to convince ourselves that it was just our imagination, but deep down we knew the truth: something was hunting us. It wasn't until we stumbled upon an abandoned cabin that we thought we might have a chance to survive. It was old and dilapidated, but it offered us shelter from the elements. As we settled in for the night, we barricaded the doors and windows, hoping to keep the creature at bay. But it wasn't long before we realized that we were not alone. Something was moving around outside, scratching at the door and whispering in a language we didn't understand. We cowered in terror, wondering if we would ever make it out alive. Days turned into weeks, and our supplies began to run out. The creature seemed to be playing with us, toying with our minds and our bodies. It would come and go, leaving behind clues and riddles that we struggled to decipher. One day, we woke up to find that the creature had left us a map. It was crudely drawn, but it seemed to lead to a nearby town. We knew it was a risk, but we had no choice but to follow it. We stumbled through the woods, exhausted and starving, until we finally saw the lights of civilization in the distance. We stumbled into the town, wild-eyed and half-mad, and collapsed in the town square. As we entered the town, I noticed that there were no street lights, making it difficult to see the road ahead. The only source of light came from the few buildings that were open. We drove around for a while until we finally found the gas station. It was old and run down, but at least it was open. I parked the car and went inside, leaving my friends in the car. The store was empty, except for a clerk who looked like he hadn't slept in days. He was wearing a dirty white t-shirt and jeans, and his eyes were bloodshot. I approached him and asked if there was a mechanic in town, but he just stared at me without saying a word. Suddenly, the door behind me opened and a man walked in. He was tall, muscular, and had a beard. He looked like he was in his 40s. He wore a dirty leather jacket and had a knife hanging from his belt. He looked at me and said, "You boys need some help?" I tried to keep my cool and told him about our car trouble. He smiled and said, "I can take a look for you, but it's going to cost you." I asked him how much, and he said, $20. I paid him, and he went outside to take a look at the car. I walked back to the car and told my friends what had happened. They looked worried, but I tried to reassure them that everything was going to be okay. A few minutes later, the man came back and said that he couldn't fix the car, but he knew a place where we could stay for the night. He told us to follow him, and we did. We drove for a few minutes until we reached a small motel on the outskirts of town. It was old and run down, just like everything else in the town. We went inside and the man introduced us to the owner. He was an old man, with white hair and a wrinkled face. He looked like he hadn't smiled in years. The man and the owner spoke for a few minutes, and then the man left. The owner gave us the keys to a room and told us to get some rest. We thanked him and went to our room. It was small, but at least it had a bed and a bathroom. As we were settling in, we heard strange noises coming from the room next door. It sounded like someone was moving furniture around. I tried to ignore it, but it was too loud. I decided to knock on the door and ask the person to keep it down. As soon as I knocked, the noises stopped. I waited for a few seconds, but nobody answered. I knocked again, but still no answer. I decided to try the door handle, and to my surprise, it was unlocked. I pushed the door open and walked inside. The room was empty, except for a few pieces of furniture. I looked around, but there was no sign of anyone. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around, but there was nobody there. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I knew that we were not alone in this motel. We took turns to sleep that night and headed home the very next day. Now let's hop on to story number 2, but before I begin reading, make sure that you have subscribed to Mr. Scare for regular horror podcasts. So I live near the countryside in the heart of United States of America. After being busy with work for months at a stretch, I decided to take a break. I had been planning this solo road trip for weeks, and finally, the day had arrived. I packed up my car with all the essentials and hit the open road. My destination was a campsite nestled deep in the heart of the United States. The idea of spending a week surrounded by nature was exhilarating, and I couldn't wait to get there. As I drove further and further away from civilization, I couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement mixed with apprehension. The winding roads were desolate, and the only sounds were the hum of my engine and the rustling of leaves in the wind. After hours of driving, I finally reached the campsite. It was nestled deep in the woods, and I had to park my car and hike a mile to reach it. As I set up my tent and started a fire, I felt at peace. The quiet of the forest was calming, and I couldn't wait to spend the next few days exploring. On the second day of my trip, I decided to take a hike. As I walked, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. The rustling of leaves and the snap of twigs beneath my feet seemed to echo through the forest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. As I turned a corner on the trail, I came face to face with a massive black bear. My heart raced as I froze in place, unsure of what to do. The bear stood on its hind legs, towering over me, and let out a deep growl. I slowly backed away, my eyes locked on the bear's. The bear took a step towards me, and I realized that I was in serious danger. I knew I had to act fast, so I reached into my backpack and pulled out a can of bear spray. I aimed it at the bear and pressed down on the nozzle, releasing a stream of pepper spray. The bear roared in pain and backed away, giving me enough time to run in the opposite direction. My heart pounding, I ran back to my campsite, constantly looking over my shoulder to make sure the bear wasn't following me. When I finally reached my tent, I collapsed inside, shaking with fear. It was then that I realized that I was completely alone in the woods with no means of communication if something went wrong. The rest of my trip was spent on high alert, constantly watching my back and listening for any signs of danger. Even the slightest rustle in the bushes made me jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. As the week came to an end, I packed up my campsite and headed back to my car. I breathed a sigh of relief as I started my engine and began the long drive back home. But as I drove, I couldn't help but feel like something was wrong. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I realized that I was being followed. I looked in my rearview mirror and saw a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me. My heart racing, I stepped on the gas, determined to outrun whatever was following me. But the eyes only seemed to get closer, and soon I realized that it wasn't just one creature following me, but an entire pack of wolves. They chased me for what felt like hours, barking and snapping at my car. I was terrified, convinced that at any moment they would break through the windows and attack me. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I reached a populated area, and the wolves gave up the chase. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands shaking and my heart pounding. I realized then that nature was not something to be trifled with, and that even the most innocent-seeming creatures might be deadly to us. Although when I told my dad about this incident, he suggested that it must have been foxes, because it's common to misinterpret them as wolves at night. And if the wolves would have wanted me dead, I would have not been here at all. Buckle up, folks. I've got a tale that'll make your skin crawl. This happened a few years back, during a road trip through Ohio with a few of my college buddies. It was supposed to be a fun weekend, exploring the state's scenic routes and trying out local cuisine. But things took a turn for the worse when we got lost on a deserted road, miles away from any town or gas station. It was a moonless night, and the only light came from our car's headlights. The road was narrow and winding, with thick forests on either side. We had been driving for hours, and the GPS had stopped working a while ago. We were relying on a hand-drawn map one of us had found at a gas station, but it seemed to be leading us in circles. We were running low on gas and had no idea where we were. Panic started to set in, and we began to argue amongst ourselves. It was then that we noticed a figure in the distance, standing by the roadside. As we got closer, we saw that it was an old man, dressed in a tattered coat and hat. He was holding a sign that read, "Need a ride?" We debated whether to stop and help him, but our fear of being stranded overruled our better judgment. We drove past him, hoping he would find another car soon. But that was just the beginning of our nightmare. The road began to narrow even more, and the forest grew thicker. We were now completely lost, with no idea which way to turn. And then, we saw him again. The old man with the sign, standing in the middle of the road, blocking our way. We were stunned by his sudden appearance, since we had just driven past him a couple of minutes back. We slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The car hit him, and we heard a sickening thud. We got out to check on him, but there was no sign of the old man. We searched the woods with flashlights, but found nothing. We were shaken, but we had to keep moving. We drove on, hoping to find a way out of the forest. But things only got worse. We started to see strange symbols carved into the trees, and heard eerie whispers on the wind. The road became steeper, and the car started to struggle. That's when we saw the house. It was a dilapidated mansion, sitting at the top of a hill, surrounded by overgrown gardens. We were desperate for help, and despite our misgivings, we decided to approach the house. As we walked up the overgrown path, we saw that the windows were boarded up, and the door was locked. But then we heard a sound, a faint scratching coming from the other side. We tried the handle again, and this time, it gave way. We stepped inside, and the stench hit us like a wave. It was like nothing we had ever smelled before, a sickly sweet odor that made us want to retch. We tried to ignore it and called out for help, but there was no answer. We walked through the darkened rooms, our flashlights barely piercing the gloom. And then we heard a scream coming from the basement. We rushed down the stairs, but what we found there will haunt me forever. There was a room lined with cages, filled with the most horrific creatures I had ever seen. They were twisted and deformed, with eyes that glowed in the darkness. And in the corner of the room, we saw the old man, grinning at us through the bars. He had somehow survived the crash, and he had led us here, to this house of horrors. We ran and pushed a wardrobe to block the door behind us. We rushed out and gunned our ride away from this house. After about another half an hour or driving in the twisting road, we came across a motel, and we spent the night there. I always thought that staying at a fancy hotel was the epitome of luxury. But that was before I checked into the old Victorian hotel in the small town of Ravenwood, Ohio. I was on a road trip to explore the rural areas of the state, and the hotel seemed like the perfect place to rest for the night. As I pulled up to the hotel, I was immediately struck by its grandeur. The sprawling building had an imposing facade with intricate carvings and balconies. It looked like a place straight out of a movie. I couldn't wait to step inside and soak in the luxury. But as soon as I entered the lobby, I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something eerie about the place that I couldn't quite put my finger on. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with a cold demeanor, checked me in without much fuss and handed me the key to my room. The room was spacious, with high ceilings and antique furniture. But as soon as I stepped inside, I felt a sense of foreboding. It was as if the room was alive with some unseen presence. The air felt heavy and oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to shake off the feeling and settled down on the bed to watch TV. But the channels were all static, and the only sound was a low hum that seemed to be emanating from the walls. I tried to call the reception to complain, but the phone was dead. As the night wore on, things only got worse. Strange noises started to emanate from the walls, and the furniture seemed to move on its own. I could hear whispers and footsteps in the hallway, but when I opened the door, there was no one there. I tried to leave the room and check out of the hotel, but the door wouldn't budge. It was as if it was bolted shut from the outside. Panic set in as I realized that I was trapped in the haunted hotel. I spent the next few hours trying to find a way out, but the hotel seemed to have a mind of its own. The walls would shift and change, leading me down endless corridors that seemed to loop back on themselves. The furniture would rearrange itself, creating dead ends and blocking my path. As the night wore on, I started to see things that I couldn't explain. Ghostly apparitions floated through the hallways, beckoning me to follow them. Shadows seemed to move on their own, coalescing into shapes that defied all logic. I was on the brink of insanity when I finally stumbled upon a hidden staircase that led to the attic. It was a small, cramped space filled with dusty furniture and cobwebs. But in the corner, I found an old trunk that seemed to be calling out to me. As I opened the trunk, I was greeted with a sight that I would never forget. Inside was a collection of old photographs and newspaper clippings. They told the story of a young girl who had been murdered in the hotel in the 1920s. Her spirit had never left, and she had been haunting the hotel ever since. With trembling hands, I read on, my heart pounding in my chest. The girl's ghost had been trapped in the hotel, unable to move on to the afterlife. But now, with the help of her story, I had finally found a way to free her. I rushed back down to the lobby and confronted the receptionist. With shaking hands, I showed her the clippings and demanded to know the truth. She broke down in tears and confessed that the hotel had been built on a farmland, which was previously a home for the Red Indian tribe. I was driving down a deserted road in the middle of nowhere. The sun had just set, and I was the only one on the road. I had been on a road trip for a few days and was looking forward to reaching my destination, but that's when I noticed something strange in my rearview mirror. There was a car behind me, and it had been following me for the last few miles. I wasn't sure what to make of it at first. Maybe it was just another traveler heading the same way as me. But the more I thought about it, the more paranoid I became. The car kept getting closer, and I could see the outline of the driver's face. They had a menacing look on their face, and I started to feel uneasy. My heart began to race, and I felt a lump forming in my throat. I decided to speed up and lose them, but the car kept up with me. My mind was racing, and I started to think of all the possible scenarios that could be happening. Maybe it was just a coincidence, or perhaps they were trying to rob me. I felt like I was being hunted, and I was scared. The car was getting closer and closer, and I knew I had to do something. I decided to take a sharp turn off the road and hide behind some trees. I waited there for a few minutes, but the car didn't pass by. I decided to continue on, but I was constantly checking my rearview mirror. I drove for a few more miles, but the car was still following me. I started to panic, and I knew I had to do something drastic. I turned off my headlights and drove in complete darkness, hoping the car would lose track of me. But it didn't. I was now driving blindly, with no idea where I was going. The car behind me was still following me, and I could hear the sound of their engine getting closer. My mind was racing, and I knew I had to do something drastic. I suddenly slammed on my brakes and jumped out of my car, hoping to catch a glimpse of the driver behind me. But as I looked back, the car had disappeared into the darkness. I was alone, and I felt like I was losing my mind. I got back in my car and continued driving. My heart was racing, and I felt like I was in a never-ending nightmare. I didn't know if the car would come back or if I was safe. I eventually reached my destination, but I was never able to shake off the feeling of being followed. To this day, I don't know who was behind the wheel of that car. But I know one thing for sure, that was the scariest night of my life, and I never want to experience anything like it again.